I planned the trip down to the smallest detail, the bags, the timing, even the way I'd hand her the tickets, because I believed effort could still fix what silence had slowly broken. She smiled when she saw the cruise tickets. She hugged me. She said thank you, but her arms loosened before mine did. And in that moment I understood something I didn't want to admit yet, that sometimes people already know how a story will end, they're just waiting for you to catch up. Have you ever been so proud of what you planned that you ignored the one thing you should have questioned? The silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles in when something goes unsaid. That's how it started for me. I remember gripping the steering wheel as I pulled into the garage, glancing at the back seat where the bags were lined up with almost obsessive care. When I opened the door and stepped inside, she looked up from the kitchen and froze for just a second, not long enough to explain, but long enough to notice. I told myself it meant nothing. I always did. I laid the bags on the table one by one, watching her hands hover awkwardly at her sides, unsure whether to help or wait. This wasn't just a trip. It was proof. Proof that I still cared. Proof that effort hadn't disappeared. Proof that whatever distance had crept into our marriage could still be undone if I tried hard enough. When I handed her the envelope, I didn't explain it. I wanted the moment to carry its own weight. She opened it, smiled when she saw the cruise tickets, laughed, hugged me, all the right responses, but her arms loosened before mine did. It was subtle, enough that I could ignore it if I wanted to. That night, as we talked about outfits and which excursions we'd take, I realized I was filling the silence more than she was. She nodded, agreed, smiled at the right moments, but didn't interrupt me with excitement the way she used to. I told myself she was just tired. I didn't want to admit that if I was wrong about her. Then this gesture wasn't romantic, it was humiliating. Days later, driving toward the port, the ocean opening up ahead of us, I felt that familiar pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when you're betting on something you don't fully understand. Boarding the ship felt symbolic, like stepping into a version of our life untouched by late nights, missed calls, and conversations that never quite finished. For a while, it worked, watching her lean against the railing, hair caught in the wind. I convinced myself effort could still outrun doubt. I needed it to. Then she turned to me, calm but deliberate, and said she needed to talk. Not urgently, not emotionally, just carefully, standing there, surrounded by laughter and music and strangers celebrating their own escapes. I understood something without fully understanding it yet, that whatever this conversation was going to be, it wasn't part of the plan I'd packed into those bags. And what unsettled me most wasn't fear of what she might say. It was the quiet certainty that she already knew exactly what she wanted to say, and I didn't. She didn't sit down right away. She stood with her fingers resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the water like she needed something steady to look at before turning to me. The ship's horn sounded somewhere behind us, loud and celebratory, completely out of sync with the way her shoulders rose when she finally exhaled. She said my name first, softly, then stopped, as if she were deciding whether to continue. I didn't rush her. I forced myself not to fill the silence the way I usually did. When she finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic. She didn't say she was unhappy. She didn't say something was wrong between us. She said she'd been thinking about the future, about how fast time was moving, how easy it was to wake up one day and realize things didn't feel as solid as they used to. Her words were calm, almost rehearsed, arranged carefully so nothing sounded like blame. She talked about work, about stress, about how exhaustion can quietly change people without asking permission. I nodded, because none of it sounded unreasonable, but as she spoke, I became aware of what she was avoiding. She talked around us instead of about us. She never said together. When she finally looked at me, her expression was open, expectant, like she needed me to agree so the conversation could land safely. I asked her what she meant by not feeling solid. She hesitated, then said maybe routine had replaced intention. Maybe we'd lost momentum without noticing. Then she said something that shifted the air between us. Maybe we needed something new to anchor us again. I asked her what she meant. She turned back toward the ocean and said she'd been thinking about having kids, sooner than we'd planned. The words settled heavily between us. We had talked about this before. Agreed to wait. Agreed to build first. I asked her what had changed. She said she didn't know exactly. Only that she felt an emptiness she couldn't explain. And that sometimes people don't realize what they're losing until they're afraid of losing it. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. But as she spoke, memories surfaced uninvited, late nights that didn't add up, calls that went unanswered, the way her phone always rested face down, the explanations that sounded fine until they piled on top of each other. I asked her, carefully, if there was anything she wasn't telling me. Her eyes widened just slightly before she shook her head and said no, too quickly, then smiled as if to smooth over something I hadn't named. She reached for my hand and said this trip had reminded her of us, of what we could be if we tried harder. I held her hand, aware of how familiar it felt, and how easily familiarity could be mistaken for truth. I told her I wanted that too, and I meant it, but the words sounded thinner than they should have. Standing there, listening to the water strike the hull, I felt something settle inside me that hadn't been there before, the realization that this conversation wasn't pulling us closer. It was drawing a careful outline around a space neither of us was willing to step into. When she leaned into my shoulder and said we'd be okay, I wrapped my arm around her and stared straight ahead, no longer wondering if something was wrong, only how long it would take before pretending otherwise became impossible. After that conversation, nothing was openly wrong, and that was what unsettled me most. The rest of the day unfolded the way vacations are supposed to. Breakfast buffets, casual laughter from nearby tables, the sun reflecting off the water so brightly it hurt to look at for too long. She talked easily with strangers, smiled when staff passed by, laughed at small things the way she always had. If someone had watched us from a distance, they would have seen a couple exactly where they were meant to be, but something had shifted in the way I watched her. I noticed pauses I would have ignored before, the way she checked her phone quickly, then slipped it back into her bag without unlocking it, the way she stepped a little farther away when she took calls, lowering her voice even when there was no one close enough to hear. I told myself not to spiral, not to turn unease into accusation. Still, my attention stayed sharp, alert in a way that felt exhausting. At dinner that night, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand while telling a story about work. And for a second I almost let myself relax. Then her phone vibrated against her leg. I felt it before I saw it, the brief stiffening of her posture. The way her words stumbled just slightly before she finished the sentence. She didn't check the screen. She didn't have to. She smiled at me, kept talking, waited until the moment passed. I asked who was texting. She said no one important. Her answer came too fast, like she'd been waiting for the question. Later, walking the deck under dim lights and artificial stars, she talked about the future again, trips we'd take, routines we'd fix, habits we'd rebuild. She spoke with confidence, outlining a version of our life that sounded complete, intentional, whole. I listened, nodded, matched her optimism where I could, but inside, something quieter was happening. Each promise felt less like a plan and more like a performance. Each reassurance sounded less like certainty and more like pressure. That night, lying beside her in the cabin while the ship cut steadily through the water, I stared at the ceiling long after she fell asleep. Her breathing was calm, even, undisturbed. Mine wasn't. I replayed the day in fragments, her careful words, the phone she never left unattended, the way she talked about children as if they were a solution rather than a beginning. I wondered when trust becomes something you check instead of feel. The next morning, while she showered, her phone lit up on the bedside table. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The name on the screen disappeared before I could read it, but the timing was enough. It felt like crossing a line without moving at all. When she came back into the room, wrapped in a towel, humming softly, she looked lighter than she had in days. She kissed my cheek, asked what I wanted to do first, talked about breakfast like nothing had changed. I smiled back, answered her, played my part, but something inside me had gone quiet, not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes when a question finally stops asking and starts waiting. I realized then that whatever this trip was meant to save, it was no longer about effort or timing or communication. It was about truth. And whether I was ready to face it, or keep pretending that love alone could drown out what I was already beginning to hear. The first crack didn't come from a confrontation. It came from the quiet way the days on board started to arrange themselves without asking us. Breakfasts where she lingered longer over her phone than her coffee. Afternoons where she said she needed time alone and I said okay too quickly. Evenings where laughter existed but never quite landed between us. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem. Everything looked fine if you didn't stare too hard. I caught myself watching instead of participating. Noticing patterns the way you do when something already feels wrong but hasn't given you permission to say it out loud yet. She laughed easily with strangers, animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. And I told myself it meant nothing, that this was what vacations were supposed to do. But the ease didn't carry back to us. At night, lying beside her while the ship hummed beneath us, I felt how carefully she positioned herself, close enough to look right, distant enough to avoid being questioned. I stopped reaching for her first, not as a test, as an instinct, and she didn't notice. Or worse, she did, and chose not to. One afternoon, standing in line for coffee, her phone buzzed. She glanced down, smiled reflexively, then caught herself and wiped the expression away like it had slipped out by accident. She didn't turn the screen toward me. She never did anymore. I didn't ask who it was. I already knew the answer wouldn't give me clarity, only confirmation I wasn't ready for. Instead, I started replaying our conversations from months ago, hearing new meanings in old sentences, realizing how often she'd spoken about feeling lost without ever asking me to help her find her way back. That night, she talked about plans, vague ones, distant ones, things she wanted to do someday, places she wanted to see, versions of herself she hadn't become yet. I noticed how rarely I appeared in those sentences. When I mentioned us, she nodded, agreed, added nothing. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was omission. The realization didn't hurt all at once. It settled slowly, like pressure building behind your eyes. I understood then that whatever she was wrestling with didn't start on this ship. And it wasn't something a trip, or a promise, could interrupt. I had been trying to fix a silence by making noise, while she had already moved into a quieter decision. The moment that broke me wasn't a fight, or a confession, or a message left unlocked. It was the calm, the way she could look at me, hold my hand, talk about the future, and still feel elsewhere. That night, as she slept beside me, breathing steady, untroubled, I stared at the ceiling and felt something unfamiliar take shape, not anger, not panic, but clarity, the understanding that love doesn't end when people stop caring. It ends when one person stops arriving fully, and the other keeps pretending effort can replace presence. By the time the lights dimmed and the ship cut cleanly through the dark water, I knew something had already shifted beyond repair. I hadn't lost her yet, but I had lost the illusion that we were moving toward the same place, and once that illusion was gone, there was no version of this trip that could put it back. By the third day, the ship had settled into its rhythm, and that's when the cracks became harder to ignore. Mornings were easy enough, coffee on the deck, polite conversation, the kind of small talk that doesn't require honesty, but everything underneath felt tense. Like a room where furniture had been moved and nothing quite fit anymore. She laughed when she was supposed to, touched my arm when it made sense to, but there was a precision to it now, an awareness that hadn't been there before. I noticed how often she checked the time, how her attention drifted during conversations, how her smiles ended a second too early when she thought I wasn't looking. At lunch, she suggested we split up for a while, a spa appointment for her. A walk around the ship for me, said it casually. Like independence was healthy, like this was normal. I agreed, even though the idea landed wrong. Alone on the deck, surrounded by strangers relaxed in ways I couldn't seem to access. I replayed the past few months again, not searching for proof anymore, just for clarity. When we met again later, She asked if I'd enjoyed the time to myself. I said yes. She nodded, relieved, like she'd passed a small test I hadn't realized we were taking. That evening, at dinner, she told a story about a coworker I didn't recognize, caught herself mid-sentence, then changed the subject. It was quick, clean, but it stayed with me. Afterward, as we walked the long corridor back to our cabin, she reached for her phone, glanced at the screen, then slipped it into her pocket without saying anything. I didn't ask. I felt something harden quietly in my chest, not suspicion exactly, but restraint, the decision to stop chasing reassurance. In the room, she moved around me with practiced familiarity, changing clothes, talking about the next day's itinerary, filling the space with logistics instead of meaning. I watched her, realizing how much effort it takes to maintain normalcy once it stops being natural. When she finally sat beside me on the bed and asked if I was okay, the question felt delayed, like an afterthought. I said I was fine. She smiled, leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment the closeness almost convinced me. Almost. But even then, I felt it, the distance inside the contact, the way comfort can exist without connection. That night, lying next to her while the ship hummed steadily beneath us, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to her breathing, wondering when we'd started mistaking silence for peace. I thought about how easy it would be to let this trip be the story we told later, how we reconnected, how things improved, and how dangerous that lie would be, because beneath the calm, beneath the routines and shared spaces, something essential had shifted, not broken yet, but loosened. And as I stared into the dark, it became clear that whatever answers I was waiting for weren't going to arrive gently. They were going to force themselves into the open, whether either of us was ready or not. The moment arrived without warning, which somehow made it harder to dismiss. We were sitting near the quieter end of the ship, far from the noise and manufactured cheer of the upper decks, when her phone vibrated on the table between us. She glanced down quickly, barely interrupting her sentence, and slid it closer to herself without looking at me. She kept talking, but the rhythm shifted, like part of her attention had already stepped away. I didn't react. I watched condensation trace slow lines down my glass and waited. A minute later, the phone vibrated again. This time she smiled, not at me, not at anything I'd said, just a brief, unguarded expression that disappeared the instant she realized I'd seen it. She picked up the phone, hesitated, then stood and said she needed to take a quick call. Her tone was light, practiced. I nodded. She walked a few steps away, turning slightly aside, lowering her voice as if distance alone could make the conversation private. I stared at the empty chair across from me, aware of how quickly quiet can change its meaning. When she returned, she asked if I wanted to head back to the cabin and rest before dinner. The word rest didn't fit, but I agreed. In the corridor, she walked a little faster than usual, phone held firmly in her hand. Inside the room, she set it on the dresser, screen dark, then moved to the window and began talking about the view, filling the space with details that didn't require engagement. I interrupted her, not sharply, but deliberately, and asked who had called. She paused, just long enough for the question to register. She said it was work. The answer came too clean. I asked why work would be calling during our trip. She shrugged, said some things couldn't wait. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes didn't settle on mine. I told her I wasn't accusing her of anything. I just wanted to understand. She exhaled slowly and said I was overthinking it. That stress had been getting to me lately. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The question became the issue. I felt the familiar urge to step back, to apologize for asking, to smooth the moment over. Instead, I stayed silent. The pause stretched longer than she seemed prepared for. She picked up the phone again, unlocked it, then stopped, her thumb hovering before she set it back down. Finally, she said she didn't want tension to ruin the trip. That was the first thing she said that felt completely honest. I nodded, because I didn't want tension either. But as she turned away and started talking about dinner plans, calm returning too quickly, I felt something settle uncomfortably into place, the awareness that this moment hadn't passed. It had been buried, that nothing had been resolved, only postponed. And standing there, watching how easily the surface smoothed over, I understood the real danger wasn't what she might be hiding. It was that I just learned how easy it was for doubt to be redirected, and how hard it might be to ask again once it was. The next day unfolded with a strange sense of coordination, like we were both committed to moving forward without acknowledging what had shifted. We stayed busy, almost deliberately so. She suggested activities back to back, a morning event, lunch somewhere crowded, a show later, filling the day with motion that left no room for stillness. I agreed to everything, partly because it felt easier than saying no, partly because I didn't trust what might surface if we slowed down. As we walked through the ship, I noticed she kept just enough distance to make it unremarkable, always a step ahead, always angled slightly outward. When we stopped to talk to other passengers, she carried the conversation effortlessly, laughing easily, directing her attention outward while I hovered on the edge of the exchange. At lunch, she laughed at a comment someone made at the next table, then glanced at me quickly, like she was checking whether the moment had registered. It had. Later, sitting side by side watching the water slide past the ship, she asked if I was having a good time. The question felt practiced, like something meant to close a loop. I said yes. She smiled, satisfied, and returned to her phone without hesitation. I didn't ask who she was texting. I realized I no longer expected an answer. That was the part that unsettled me most. In the afternoon, she said she wanted some time alone, to read, to relax, to clear her head. She framed it carefully, as something healthy, something couples should encourage. I told her it was fine, and it was. Sitting elsewhere, watching strangers pass in and out of conversations that meant nothing to me, I felt a quiet displacement take hold. It wasn't anger or jealousy. It was the realization that I was no longer central to her internal world. When we met again before dinner, she seemed lighter than she had all trip, talking easily about a book she'd started, a conversation she'd had, how good the space had felt. I listened, noticing how relaxed she was now that nothing personal was being asked of her. That night, she suggested sitting at the bar instead of a table, said it felt more casual. The evening fractured into shared conversations with people we'd never see again. At one point, I became aware that she hadn't looked directly at me in several minutes. Walking back to the cabin, she slipped her arm through mine, the gesture familiar enough to be reassuring, distant enough to feel automatic. She said she was glad we were taking this trip, glad we were reconnecting. I agreed, because correcting her felt heavier than letting the words pass. Standing at the cabin door while it unlocked, I understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever space I'd been trying to close with effort and patience, she had already learned how to live inside, and I was the only one still pretending it hadn't become permanent. That night, sleep came in fragments. The cabin was quiet in the way only enclosed spaces can be, the low hum of the ship steady beneath us. She lay turned away, breathing slow and even, one arm tucked under the pillow like she'd already decided where the night would end. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in pieces, how easily she filled time with motion. The relief in her voice when distance was framed as something healthy. The way conversation flowed best when nothing personal was being asked. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. Everything had an explanation if I wanted to keep believing the version of us I'd brought onto the ship. At some point she shifted, reached back without turning, her hand brushing my wrist before pulling away. The gesture should have been comforting. Instead, it felt final, like a habit carried out without thought. Lying there, I realized I hadn't been patient. I'd been avoiding the moment when clarity would demand a response from me. The next morning, over coffee that had gone untouched, she talked about the day ahead, listing plans with the ease of someone keeping things orderly. I listened, nodding, until I understood that each suggestion quietly prevented any real conversation from forming. When she asked what I wanted to do, I paused. The silence held. She looked up, waiting. I said I wasn't sure. It was the first honest thing I'd said without cushioning it. Something shifted in her expression, not fear, not guilt, but assessment, as if she were deciding how much needed to be said to maintain balance. She smiled and said we could decide later, walking the deck alone afterward. I leaned against the railing and watched the water trail behind the ship before dissolving. We were moving forward, but nothing stayed long enough to examine. That thought settled heavily. It wasn't about whether she was hiding something anymore. It was about whether I was willing to keep living inside uncertainty because it felt safer than confrontation. When we met again that afternoon, she resumed conversation easily, asking about my walk, commenting on the view, treating the day like nothing had shifted. I responded, stayed present, even smiled, but internally, something had crossed a line. The effort required to keep everything smooth had begun to outweigh the comfort it provided. Standing there with her, surrounded by open sky and water stretching endlessly in every direction, I felt the collision clearly, not between us, but within myself, the understanding that whatever truth existed, I was already paying for it, and that continuing this way would eventually cost me more than facing it ever could. By the next morning, I stopped waiting for clarity to arrive on its own. Instead, I changed the way I paid attention, not searching for proof, not forcing conclusions, just noticing what happened when I said less. At breakfast, I let pauses stretch instead of filling them. She noticed. She always did. She spoke a little more than usual, explaining small things that didn't require explanation, keeping the space occupied. As we walked through a crowded part of the ship later, I slowed my pace without announcing it. She moved ahead naturally, weaving through people with ease, glancing back once before continuing forward. It wasn't avoidance. It was familiarity. In the afternoon, she suggested we spend some time apart again, presenting it casually, like an obvious choice rather than a request. I agreed, sitting alone near the edge of the deck. I watched other couples exist without managing each other, some engaged, some distant, all honest in ways that felt unexpectedly rare. I realized I wasn't comparing us to them. I was paying attention to what no longer felt mutual. When we met again before dinner, she asked how my afternoon had been. I answered simply. She responded with enthusiasm, describing hers in detail, naming people I didn't know, moments I hadn't shared. At dinner, conversation stayed light, carefully balanced. She laughed easily, reached for my hand at familiar points, checked in just enough to maintain rhythm. It wasn't fake, it was controlled. Walking back afterward, she talked about how good the trip had been for us, how she felt clearer, more centered. I listened, aware that clarity didn't mean the same thing to both of us. Back in the cabin, as she showered, the room filled with the muted sounds of running water, I sat on the edge of the bed, realizing that I no longer needed new signs to understand what was happening. When she returned, she asked if I wanted to sleep or sit outside longer. I said I was tired. Lying there later, listening to her breathing even out, I felt something settle beneath the uncertainty, not resolve, not relief, but readiness. I wasn't angry or afraid. I wasn't preparing to confront her yet. I was preparing myself for the moment when pretending would no longer be an option, and whatever truth surfaced would have to be met without negotiation. The shift didn't arrive with a decision or a dramatic moment. It settled in quietly, like something that had been waiting for permission. I didn't wake up ready to confront anything. I woke up aware that guessing had reached its limit. Over breakfast, I listened more than I spoke, noticing how her attention moved, how easily it drifted beyond the table even while she talked to me. When I asked about her plans after we returned home, she answered smoothly, then added details I hadn't asked for, layering explanations where none were needed. It wasn't panic, it was fluency. Later that morning, as she got ready for an activity she'd signed up for alone, she mentioned a name in passing, someone she'd met the day before, then moved on without context. I didn't interrupt. I let it sit. Walking the deck afterward, I understood I wasn't looking for a single confirmation anymore. I was watching what stayed consistent and what didn't. At lunch, I asked about her morning again, phrasing it slightly differently. Her response landed close enough to feel intentional. far enough to register. When I followed up, she smiled, adjusted a detail, and redirected the conversation with practiced ease. Sitting across from her later, the ocean sliding past the windows, I felt certainty build the way pressure does, gradually, without noise, not through one contradiction, but through accumulation. When she spoke about the future, it was open-ended, flexible, filled with options. When she spoke about the present, it was curated. That evening, she suggested somewhere loud and busy. I agreed. In the crowd, she relaxed in a way she hadn't all day, moving easily between conversations, her laughter unguarded, her attention unanchored. At one point, she stepped away to take a call, gesturing casually that she'd be right back. I didn't watch her leave. I noticed how long it took before she returned. When she did, she apologized lightly, offered a brief explanation, then asked a question meant to reset the moment. I answered it. Back in the cabin later, she talked about how distance from routine gives you perspective, how stepping outside your life can change how you see things. I agreed, because I finally understood what that meant. Perspective wasn't revealing something new, it was removing what I'd been protecting. Lying there in the dark, listening to the ship move steadily forward, I didn't feel shock or betrayal. I felt alignment, the kind that comes when doubt stops arguing with evidence. I didn't know every detail yet. I didn't need to. What mattered now wasn't whether something was happening, it was that pretending it wasn't had become impossible. Clarity didn't make me restless. It steadied me. Once the guessing stopped, the day unfolded more slowly, each moment feeling deliberate instead of heavy. I moved through it aware of my choices, when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to let things pass without shaping them. She noticed the shift even if she didn't name it. Over lunch, she asked if something was on my mind. I said I was tired. It wasn't a lie. I was tired of interpreting. That afternoon, we sat side by side watching the horizon dissolve into water, neither of us reaching for the other. The distance wasn't tense. It was accepted. I understood then that decisions don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they show up already made, waiting to be acknowledged. When she talked about fitting in one last activity, one last shared moment before the trip ended, I heard the effort beneath the words, an attempt to preserve a feeling rather than address what was missing. I agreed where agreement cost nothing. Inside, something took shape quietly, not anger, not resolve, but direction. I wasn't preparing to expose anything yet. I was deciding how I wanted to leave this version of us behind. That evening, she suggested dinner somewhere familiar, said it felt comforting. We ate without friction, conversation smooth and careful, the kind that knows its own rhythm too well to disrupt. She reached for my hand once, briefly, then returned to her glass. I let the gesture pass without attaching meaning to it. Walking back afterward, she said she was glad we'd come, glad we'd stepped away from everything. I said I was too, and I was, not because things were fixed, but because distance had given me separation from the version of myself that believed effort alone could repair what honesty never touched. Back in the cabin, as she packed a few things for the morning, I watched quietly, noticing how efficiently she moved, how little of herself lingered in each space. That's when it settled fully. Whatever conversation waited ahead didn't belong here. This place was temporary. Answers would drift here. I needed solid ground. Lying awake later, listening to the steady motion beneath us, I felt no urgency. There would be no confrontation driven by emotion. No questions asked before I was ready to hear the answers. The decision wasn't about ending things yet. It was about ending my willingness to live without clarity. When morning came, I woke calm, aware only of this: whatever happened next would happen deliberately, without spectacle, without pleading, and without pretending. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough to stand on. The next morning didn't arrive with relief or answers. It arrived the way mornings do when something important has already shifted and the world hasn't caught up yet. She was still asleep when I woke, her breathing slow, one arm resting in the space I'd just left. I watched her for a moment, not searching for signs, not trying to interpret anything, only noticing how familiar this scene had once felt, and how distant it felt now. There was no surge of emotion, no dramatic certainty. What settled in instead was something steadier, the kind that comes when you stop questioning the observations you've been quietly collecting for months. When she woke, she smiled like yesterday had done what it was supposed to do, like something had been repaired. We talked about breakfast, about timing, about ordinary plans that didn't require honesty, and in that simplicity, the truth became obvious. Not sharply, cleanly. We weren't misunderstanding each other, we were speaking from different points in the same story. She was reaching backward, trying to preserve what we had been. I was standing in the present, recognizing what it had become. Later, back at the railing, I understood that this trip hadn't revealed a secret or confirmed a fear. It had removed distractions. It showed me that reassurance can feel hollow when alignment is missing, and that comfort can exist without certainty. I didn't confront her. I didn't push for explanations or clarity she might not have had. I accepted something quieter but undeniable. Wanting the same future means nothing if the reasons don't match. When she asked if I felt better, I said yes, and this time it was true. Not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped needing them to be. As the ship slowed and land came into view, I felt no urgency to decide what came next. I only knew what couldn't continue as it was. There was no villain here, no dramatic ending, just two people holding the same words with different meanings, and one of them finally listening to the discomfort instead of explaining it away. When we stepped off the ship, she reached for my hand like she always had. I took it, feeling its familiarity one last time, aware that some endings don't announce themselves. They don't collapse or explode. They simply stop asking you to pretend there's something else. By the time the ship returned to port, the noise felt louder than it had when we left, not because it had changed, but because I had. Luggage rattled across the floor, voices overlapped, announcements echoed overhead, and yet it all felt distant, like I was watching the end of something from a few steps outside myself. We stood in line together, passports in hand, shoulders nearly touching, close enough to look united, far enough to feel separate. She talked about practical things, the drive home, unpacking later, work the next morning, and I responded when needed, aware that this was the version of us that still worked, functional, polite, intact on the surface. What we didn't say traveled with us, heavier than any suitcase. When we finally stepped onto solid ground, I expected relief. Instead, I felt something quieter and harder to ignore. On the drive home, the road stretched out in front of us, familiar and unremarkable, and I realized how much effort I'd spent trying to revive something instead of asking whether it was still alive. At a stoplight, she reached for the radio, filling the silence, and I noticed how often we'd done that, mistaking noise for connection. Back in the house, I unpacked slowly, pausing over items that had felt important just days earlier. None of them carried the meaning I'd assigned to them. That evening, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, without bags or schedules or excuses, the conversation finally happened without planning or defense. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was careful and honest in a way we hadn't allowed before. We talked about timing, about fear, about how wanting different futures doesn't make either person wrong, just no longer aligned. There were long pauses, and for once, I didn't rush to fill them. When we finished, nothing was decided, but something was finally clear. That night, lying awake, I understood that endings don't always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes they reveal themselves quietly, through patterns you stop defending and truths you stop avoiding. In the days that followed, life didn't fall apart. It adjusted. Conversations became simpler. Expectations loosened. The future stopped feeling like something I had to force into shape. And what surprised me most wasn't the sadness, it was the calm. The realization that letting go of a story that no longer fits doesn't mean it was a mistake. It means it ran its course. I don't regret the trip, or the effort, or even the denial. Those moments showed me what commitment looks like, and what it doesn't. They taught me that love isn't measured by how tightly you hold on, but by whether both people are still holding on for the same reason. And that understanding didn't save the relationship, but it saved me from staying inside a question that had already answered itself. The days that followed didn't announce themselves as different, they arrived the same way every other day did. Alarms rang, coffee brewed, sunlight moved across the floor on schedule. From the outside, nothing had changed quickly enough to draw attention. Inside, everything felt slightly off, like a room rearranged just enough that you keep reaching for things that aren't where you expect them to be. We moved through the house without tension but without closeness, passing each other in doorways, exchanging practical words that carried no extra meaning. I noticed how quiet my mind felt without constantly preparing for conversations that might or might not happen. The silence wasn't heavy, it was neutral. One evening, while folding laundry, I realized how automatically I'd been doing things for a long time, believing consistency meant stability. It didn't. It meant maintenance. Days later, when we talked again, it wasn't emotional or dramatic. It was precise. We spoke about schedules, space, and what the next few weeks would look like. The calm surprised me. I'd expected fear or resistance, but instead there was a sense of acknowledgement, not agreement, but acceptance. That night, I went for a walk alone, letting the steady rhythm of streetlights pace my thoughts. With each block, a question surfaced that no longer needed defending. How long had I known this wasn't something I could fix alone? The answer didn't arrive as blame. It arrived as clarity. Love doesn't disappear suddenly, it changes shape. Slowly enough that you can convince yourself it's still the same. But there comes a point when effort stops moving anything forward and only keeps it in place. Over the next few days, I noticed small shifts in myself. I chose music without thinking about volume. I made plans without checking how they might land. I slept more deeply than I had in months. None of it felt like freedom yet. It felt like learning balance after stepping off something unstable. There were moments of sadness, habits reaching for someone who was no longer standing in the same place, but they passed without pulling me backward. What remained was understanding. That commitment only works when it moves in the same direction. That wanting something badly doesn't make it possible. And that staying in something out of fear of ending it quietly erodes you more than walking away honestly. By the end of the week, nothing had been officially labeled or finalized. But something important had ended all the same. The belief that effort alone could carry two people toward a future only one of them was ready for. And while that realization unsettled me, it also grounded me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to hold anything together. I was simply standing where I was, aware, steady, and no longer pretending the ground beneath me was something it wasn't. The moment that set everything in motion didn't arrive as a confrontation. It emerged quietly over a few ordinary evenings, in conversations that never escalated but also never circled back to comfort. There was no announcement, no dramatic shift in tone, just a growing recognition beneath the words that continuing as we were would mean forcing something that no longer moved on its own. We talked about space first, then time, then what it would mean to step apart without turning it into a battle. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was. It felt as though the hardest part had already happened long before we admitted it out loud. When the decision finally settled, it didn't feel like loss as much as release, the relief of no longer bracing against a truth we'd both been quietly adjusting to. The first night alone, the house sounded unfamiliar. Every creak felt sharper, every pause more noticeable. I lay awake longer than usual, not replaying arguments, but noticing how few loose ends remained. The absence wasn't painful, it was open. Over the next days, we separated things carefully, books, kitchen items, routines, without resentment, aware that clarity mattered more than symmetry. Each small choice made the shift more real. I found myself checking in with emotions I'd been deferring for months, and they arrived without chaos. Sadness passed through without taking over. Nostalgia surfaced without pulling me backward. Mostly, there was steadiness paired with something new, direction. Friends asked questions, and I answered simply, realizing I no longer needed elaborate explanations once I stopped arguing with myself. My body noticed the change before my mind did, shoulders dropping, breath slowing, sleep stretching deeper into the night. Without the constant effort of trying to align two different futures, my attention returned to ordinary things. Cooking felt focused. Walks felt quiet instead of rehearsed. Plans no longer required defense. One afternoon, while packing the last box, I came across a small reminder from the trip, something I'd once believed could hold everything together. I turned it over in my hands, then set it aside, understanding that effort isn't wasted simply because it doesn't deliver the outcome you hoped for. It shows you where your responsibility ends. That evening, alone in a space no longer shaped by compromise, I felt an unfamiliar alignment between what I knew and what I was doing. The separation didn't resolve every uncertainty ahead, but it removed the one thing that had been draining me quietly, the ongoing negotiation with a reality that wasn't meeting me halfway. As I turned off the lights and settled into the stillness, I understood that moving forward doesn't require certainty or confidence. Sometimes it only requires the decision to stop standing still out of fear. And in that decision, something stable began to take shape, not loud, not dramatic, but real. The apartment was quiet in a way the house never had been. Not empty, just neutral. No shared routines echoing in the walls. No unspoken expectations waiting for me to meet them. I set my keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, realizing this was the first space I'd entered in years that asked nothing from me. I didn't unpack. I sat on the edge of the couch instead and let the stillness settle, noticing how different it felt from the silence I'd grown used to, the kind filled with unanswered questions. This was cleaner, harder, maybe, but honest. My phone buzzed on the table. I didn't pick it up. I already knew who it was. Instead, I stared at the blank wall and replayed the last few days in fragments, the way she smiled at dinner, the certainty in her voice when she said we'd be okay, the moment her hands started shaking when she opened the envelope. There was no satisfaction in that memory, only finality. People imagine leaving as loud, dramatic, driven by anger, but by the time you actually walk away, most of the noise is already gone. What's left is clarity. I poured a glass of water, then another, realizing I wasn't thirsty, I just needed something to do with my hands. I thought about the version of myself who planned the trip, who believed effort could fix anything if it was delivered carefully enough. I didn't judge him. He did the best he could with what he knew. But I understood now that effort without truth isn't love, it's bargaining. And I was finished bargaining. The messages kept coming. Long ones. Short ones. Apologies tangled with explanations. Regret mixed with fear. I didn't read them. Not out of cruelty, but because I already had, just stretched across months instead of arriving all at once. Silence. This time, wasn't punishment. It was protection. That night, I slept without setting an alarm. In the morning, I woke up disoriented for a moment, instinctively reaching toward an empty side of the bed before stopping myself. I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the city move, surprised by how quickly the world continued without checking in on me. Over the next few days, life simplified. Paperwork, calls, decisions that no longer felt emotional, just necessary. I didn't feel free the way movies promise. I felt grounded, like I'd finally stopped holding my breath. Occasionally, guilt surfaced, not for leaving, but for staying as long as I did, for teaching myself to ignore instincts that had been trying to protect me. But guilt passed. What remained was quieter and stronger, respect for the boundary I finally enforced. I wasn't rebuilding yet. I wasn't chasing happiness. I was simply learning the shape of a life that no longer required me to pretend. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. People like to believe endings arrive with clarity, a final conversation, a shared understanding, some sentence that explains everything. This one didn't. There was no last call, no attempt to reshape what had already fallen apart. Just distance, days turning into weeks. Weeks settling into the quiet understanding that whatever we had once been now existed only in memory. I moved forward deliberately after that. Not fast, not slow, just forward. I returned books I'd borrowed and never finished. I stopped driving past places tied to versions of us I no longer needed to visit. I learned that healing doesn't announce itself, it shows up in small moments. Like realizing you didn't think about them for an entire afternoon. I never hated her. That surprised me. What remained instead was a steady sadness for something that could have been honest, but wasn't. Trust isn't broken all at once, it erodes quietly. Until one day you realize you're standing on ground that can't hold you anymore. Walking away wasn't an act of strength or punishment. It was acknowledgement. Of limits. Of reality. Of the truth I'd spent too long negotiating with. I stopped asking what I could have done differently. Because that question assumes responsibility for choices that were never mine to make. Love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's proven by how much truth you're willing to require. Some nights, the silence returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt settled. I filled my time with ordinary things, morning walks, unfamiliar streets, conversations that didn't require explanations. Slowly, I recognized myself again, not the man trying to hold something together, but the one who knew when to let go. If this story leaves anything behind, it isn't bitterness or warning. It's clarity, about what commitment actually demands, about the cost of ignoring what you already know, and about the quiet strength of choosing dignity over denial. I didn't get the ending I planned. I got the one that was honest. And in the end, that mattered more than staying in a story that only worked if I kept pretending.